The Gauteng government, in partnership with municipalities and the private sector, will convene a two-day inaugural Gauteng Infrastructure Investment Conference in Midrand starting tomorrow. The conference will discuss the Gauteng city region infrastructure needs and plans. Earlier, we spoke to the Gauteng Economic Development, Environment, Agriculture and Rural Development MEC, Lebogang Maile, who elaborated further on the objectives of the conference.
We've got a number of infrastructure challenges as a country, as you know. We still need to build more roads, we still need to build more schools, we still need to build more houses, we have energy problems, we've got lack of sufficient access, for instance, to internet connectivity and broadband, amongst many other challenges that we face. So we thought, as the Gauteng provincial government, let us be innovative and have a conference that will take place every year. This is an inaugural conference, and in this conference, let's look at inviting the municipalities, national government, the private sector, both local and international investors and potential investors. So this conference will basically try to position Gauteng city region as a preferred destination for investment, and not just for infrastructure only, but to also share ideas with the private sector
on how best to address
other
this.
spheres of government, on how best to address these challenges that we are facing.
We will touch on the issue of international investors. I want us to talk about the issue of the dilapidated buildings in the city center. When one talks about infrastructure, what programs do you have to try and resolve the makeup of these buildings?
The challenge is not just a lack of infrastructure, it's also about maintenance of this infrastructure, and not just in the public sector, even in the private sector, because some of the buildings you're talking about, these are buildings that are owned by government, some of them, and others are owned by the private sector. And unfortunately, some of these buildings have become havens for criminals, and criminal activities are being conducted there. And one of the things that working with the cities, not just the city of Johannesburg, because this is not just a unique challenge to Johannesburg.
Problem unique to Johannesburg
yes,
alone.
Even in other cities we have this kind of a problem. Will be to make sure that firstly we take out those people who have illegally occupied those buildings. And you know, in certain instances it's a challenge to take out illegal occupants, and we must just make sure that we follow the law, and we also ensure that we take them out of those buildings. And those buildings, if they're owned by government, some of them would have to be leased to the private sector, because some of the private people have the money to develop them, whether into residential areas or into residential outlets or into retail outlets, whichever ideas they have. And some of them we might need to utilize for other public use, like schools and all that.
And let me ask you about the decay and the filth that you find on some of the streets in Gauteng. What are the processes that we have in place to deal with that?
That's another big challenge for us, and a concern, because we want to see a Gauteng that is livable, that is environmentally friendly and sustainable. We don't just want to concentrate on issues of social cohesion, on issues of economic inclusion. And that's why through the department, the other department that I head of of agriculture and environment, we are launching a campaign. In fact, it's a campaign we've always been having. We're actually taking it to the next level, which is going to see us mobilizing communities in different wards, in schools, in hospitals, in the taxi ranks, in the NGOs, in the political formations, and everywhere you find people, young and old, rich and poor, to start taking issues of environmental sustainability serious, because we can't afford to live in places that are a health hazard, because in other areas it is actually not livable. It's actually unhealthy for people to be there. So we need to come in and working with those communities, because it's not just the government responsibility to ensure that our environment is sustainable, is safe and clean. It's everybody's responsibility. So we also need to work on changing the attitudes and the behaviors of people, because it's easy to throw a paper out of a window of a car, or a can of a cold drink. So we need to get people to start appreciating that it's not right
their behavior
to do certain things, and we need to start them whilst they're still young. And that's why it's important that we will be working with the Department of Education.
You have the international investors attending the conference, and what role are they bringing into this conference?
Well, we've got quite a few international investors that have responded positively, who will be flying in directly, but some of them already have got operations here in Gauteng, because these are people who already have confidence in South Africa and in the province, and they just want to see and understand how can they work better with us going forward, because they're interested in investing. So that's why in the Infrastructure Investment Conference, we will be showcasing some of the projects that we want the private sector to invest in, because we wouldn't have enough resources as the provincial government to fund them.
You're also looking about growing the city around the OR Tambo Airport here at home. What do those plans look like?
Well, we've got big plans for the Inaugural, what we'll call the Eastern Corridor of Development in Gauteng. We have prioritized a project called a retropolis, meaning a city that is built and that grows around the airport, because through that airport, which is a strategic asset of the country, there are a number of projects that are planned. One of them is a jewelry manufacturing project, which is going to be around that area. Another, for instance, it's what we call it's going to be around the Springs. It's an inland logistics hub. And there will be many others around agro-processing and all that. In the last 5 years, we have done a lot of work in putting together a feasibility study on what projects can be done. And if I'm not mistaken, there's about 30 plus projects that have been conceptualized around the area of Eguruleni and in that airport. But we're looking at linking what happens in the OR Tambo Airport with what could happen at the Wonderboom Airport, for instance, in Tshwane, at Lanseria Airport in the Western Corridor Western Corridor of Development. So there's quite a lot of things that we'll be doing in relation to transport, not just the airports, looking at the freeways. We're looking at the Gautrain, for instance, expanding it, because as you know, it has been one of the good stories to tell in the last few years, and we have seen the number of people using Gautrain increasing on a daily basis, and there's a need for more trains, and that's why we're looking at the feasibility and looking at how we can get the money to increase that.
And how do you plan to source out the money? Out of the existing fiscus, or you are thinking of getting money out of the fiscus?
Well, there are a number of ways. In fact, firstly, for the next 15 years, we need at least 1 trillion rand for all the things that we want to do in terms of infrastructure development. It's a lot of money. We don't have that money, and that's why we have to look at other creative ways. That's why we're talking to the banks. We're talking to other state-owned funding agencies. We're talking to the administrators of pensions, for instance. We're talking to the international investors, and that's why we've invited them here. And some of the people we've invited is people who have already had discussions with. We've already been to Turkey, India. Recently we're in Portugal with the Premier. We'll still be going to other countries where we are meeting with the investors, and most of them are positive, they are happy. Of course, they will have concerns there and there about issues like electricity, for instance, issues like turnaround time on compliance documents, which we are dealing with those issues with them.
In wrapping up, can you just define for us the difference between social and economic infrastructure in the case of what you intend to do?
Well, if you look at infrastructure like schools, infrastructure like hospitals, it's purely social infrastructure. But you've got infrastructure like electricity, water, which is both used for social purposes and for economic purposes. And then including infrastructure like roads, you know. Not everybody uses roads for business, for going to work and all that. People uses roads for other things and all that. But there is that clear commitment and focus on our part to not just focus on social infrastructure, because the bulk of our budget from the fiscus goes towards social infrastructure, and very limited resources goes towards economic infrastructure. And that is the infrastructure which we want to partner with the private sector, because there are return on investment on some of that infrastructure, and therefore there is a basis for them to invest and they can see returns in future.
That was Lebogang Maile, MEC for Economic Development, Environment, Agriculture and Rural Development in Gauteng. He was talking to us about the objectives of the inaugural Gauteng Infrastructure Investment Conference in Midrand starting tomorrow.